Recording. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today. So we're featuring around 10 different topics started last month through end of June next year. And they're going to be presented on the third Tuesday of each month from 12 p.m. The information that is going to be covered today is Food Safety Modernization Act coverage, untangle the language, and know how the rules affect your farm. Today's speaker is Don Stokel. He's with Cornell University, and he's part of the Produce Safety Alliance. Don is an environmental microbiologist, a water quality specialist, and a produce safety trainer. He has over 15 years of professional research experience at both private and government labs, resulting in a body of peer-reviewed research articles, extension publications, government reports, review articles, and book chapters. Don is a senior extension associate with the Produce Safety Alliance team at Cornell University, and he's been in this role since 2015. Other than 2021-2022, when he served as a senior environmental scientist at California Department of Food and Agriculture Produce Safety Program. His role at the Produce Safety Program is to take on special projects, specifically addressing water quality issues and responses to continued evolution of the Food Safety Modernization Act, especially the produce safety rule. Thank you, Don, for joining the webinar and presenting today. Next slide, please. So the key thing about today's webinar, the distinction among the three categories of farms under the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule. Example, not covered, qualified exempt, and fully covered. We're also going to go over what produce is covered under the Produce Safety Rule, what produce is not covered under the Produce Safety Rule, and then describe some enforcement policies to help produce farms understand their status under the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule. Next slide, please. Just so you are all aware, the resources from this webinar and other webinars, both past and in the future, will be posted on our website. So visit UC Small Farms Food Safety website. So if you type that into Google or any other search engine, you should be able to find the results and then go into training resources or events, and then you'll see the resources from various activities that we offer. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, the resources from the webinar will be recorded, they'll be archived, and you can review them on a need basis at any time on our website. Great. Don, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and we can get started.
That sounds great. Let me try to multitask. I'll just share that in addition to my screen, is my screen sharing okay?
Yes.
Whenever a person reads your bio, you say, "Oh, I thought I trimmed that down, but it's still way too long." So thank you for the invitation to come back to California briefly, even if only remotely, and talk to y'all about the coverage status of the exemptions and exclusions in produce safety rule. And as the diagram showed, there are a lot of complexities. So let's start with the FSMA Food Safety Modernization Act, and just recognizing that there are currently 9 rules that provide farm to fork protection for the food system in the U.S. When we talk about the produce safety rule, which is part 112, but that the produce safety rule covers farms. So basically it's the base of the food system. Then the next is the preventive controls rule for human foods. When a farm sells their product to a processor and it gets turned into a processed food, those processes are covered by the PC rule for human foods. Another one is the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. So FSMA requirements apply not just to foods that are grown or created in the United States, they also apply to other foods that are imported from other countries. So if a farm is operating both in the US or outside of the US, or if the farm is only operating outside of the US, their compliance with the same food safety standards as US farms or facilities will be governed by the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And then finally, there's the food traceability rule, which is a new rule. It has been finalized, but compliance states have been put off until 2028, which allows tracking through lot numbering of certain foods that are on something called the food traceability list, which is some products that have been implicated in outbreaks in the recent past. So think about leafy greens, think about tomatoes, and a few other crops that are on the food traceability list. Each one of those has exemptions and exclusions. And here's the diagram of some of the words that come up when we talk about exemptions and exclusions. And what we're going to try to do today is just talk through and walk through what's the meaning of these words so that people who are either working at farms and need to understand their status, or working with farms and are helping farms understand their status, so we recognize what these words mean, what the significance of those words is as we talk about the status under the rule. Most of you can probably count pretty well, and you know that I've said that there are 9 rules, but I've only listed 4. And that's because farms are excluded from the other 5 rules. So these other 5 rules play an important role in the farm to fork food protection system under FSMA, but they're going to be geared toward other operations that are not jurisdictional farms. So let's talk about coverage of the Produce Safety Rule and Food Safety Modernization Act. It matters for a lot of people. It matters because you might be inspected in California. The California Department of Food and Agriculture Produce Safety Program has a team of inspectors who go out and inspect at California farms. Other states have other inspectional teams that may be state level or they might be FDA. But whether you're inspected, and these are always scheduled inspections, but whether you should be prepared to be inspected under produce safety rule depends on whether you're covered by the rule. So it's important to know whether you're covered. If you are covered, that's going to really affect what documentation you need to keep. And if you're exempt from most requirements, some of the exemptions say, yeah, you're exempt except for the paperwork that allows you to demonstrate that you're exempt. So we'll talk through some of those things. Let's talk about why it doesn't matter whether you're covered or not. Many of you work not just under produce safety rule, but also your buyers have requirements of you. And the buyer's requirements are because that's what the buyer wants. They may not really be concerned about whether you're covered by produce safety rule. If they want you to have a Primus audit or a global gap audit or a harmonized audit, that's what your buyer requires. So your coverage status under FSMA doesn't really matter. Same with LGMA or other marketing agreements. If your marketing agreement requires that you be audited and that you conduct certain practices, whether you're covered or not under produce safety rule, you're still going to be following those practices. And then finally, all of us have a responsibility. We try to avoid harm to consumers. That's really who we're serving, as the consumers. We want to deliver food that's healthy, nutritious, and will not make people sick. And part of that is, well, there's liability from harm, strict liability. Even if you're covered, whether or not you are covered, if a person becomes ill because of food that came from you, you have some vulnerability to liabilities for causing harm to that consumer. So just be aware of those things, because I think that really underscores that knowing the regulatory requirements helps you as a grower, packer, or shipper of produce stay aligned with industry standards, and it helps you make decisions that are going to be protective of produce safety, whether or not they're required. So call that a pitch to not just know your status, because it's useful to know whether you're going to be inspected and what records to keep. But also, even if you find out that you're not covered or you're exempt from most requirements of the regulation, stick around and go through the rest of these webinars in this series, because you'll learn things that allow you to be aligned with industry standards, and you'll learn things that allow you to protect produce safety and make decisions that are protective. And it's good information from good people. So the scope of this webinar is going to be coverage and exemptions under produce safety rule, The other FSMA rules have their own interrelated exemptions. We can talk about those if you'd like. I know a lot of them, not all of them, but we can talk about those during Q&A. The key document for FSMA produce safety rule is this flow chart. It's available at the FDA website, and I believe Tice will be able to share the URLs that I put on the slides with people in an after webinar communication, so you don't have to try to write it down. It's just called the Coverage and Exemptions Exclusions Flow Chart. In addition to things that are in the flow chart, this is what is in the produce safety rule itself. There are also temporary policies. FDA makes pragmatic decisions about, well, okay, we're not going to enforce this particular provision at this time because of something. And so they have something called enforcement discretion that means that for a time period, they're not going to enforce a particular requirement, often because there's something that ought to be fixed. And then there are some exemptions from individual requirements. And one example is and I actually trimmed out these slides. So if you want to see them, go ahead and ask during Q&A. But there is a one regulation exemption from something called the agricultural water assessment. And we could talk about, but those exemptions we're not talking about in this webinar unless you ask, in which case we can talk about the single requirement exemptions as well. But we're really just going to focus on the exemptions for the broad produce safety rule in this webinar. We're going to break this down a little bit differently from the flow chart, and we're going to break this down into two different types of allowances. First off, let's say that one of the allowances is that you're either not covered by the produce safety rule or you are exempt, meaning as long as you can satisfy conditions of exemption, you don't have to follow most of the rule. If you're not covered, you don't have to do any of the regulatory, you're not required to do the regulatory requirements. As we said earlier, it may still be a good idea, but if you're exempt, you still have to follow some of the regulatory requirements. And those exemptions and exclusions or not covered status can apply to either a farm or a individual product. So we're going to start with the ones that apply to the entire farm. A farm can be exempt depending on what type of crop it grows. Fresh produce is the scope of produce safety rule. A farm can be exempt depending on what it does. If it grows, harvests, packs, or holds produce that is covered, then it might be covered by the rule. If it doesn't do those things, well, then it's not covered by the rule. A farm can be not covered depending on the value of produce sales. If it sells so little produce that it's unlikely to make a strong effect on consumers, then those smaller farms are not covered by produce safety rule. And finally, there's an exemption. The first three were all not covered issues. This fourth one is an exemption, and there's a calculation that you can do in certain conditions that are met that would allow you to be eligible for something called a qualified exemption, which targets relatively small farms that are selling their product in a relatively local area. So we're going to talk about each one of those in this first section, and we'll start with what is covered. And what is covered is produce that is a raw agricultural commodity. This is an excerpt from the definition of the produce safety rule, but really what's important is to recognize that produce is fruits, vegetables, mushrooms, peanuts, tree nuts, and herbs in general. What's not produce that is also grown on farms is things like food grains, barley, field corn, sorghum, oats and rice, wheat, amaranth, quinoa, buckwheat, oil seeds, including sunflower seeds. These are things that are not covered by produce safety rule. And if you think about each one of these things, they're typically processed and cooked. And they're not considered produce. They're outside the scope of the produce safety rule. The second part that sometimes is overlooked is that it's going to be a raw agricultural commodity. And all that means is that it's not cut, ground, cooked, frozen, or otherwise processed into something else. Product that is processed into something else is covered by the Preventive Controls Rule for Human Foods, and operations that process commodities into something outside of its natural state are called facilities. So that's where we come into this line between a farm and a facility. A farm is covered by produce safety rule. It's dealing with produce that's raw agricultural commodity. A facility is something that processes raw agricultural commodities into something else. And those are called, again, those are called facilities. And it is possible to be a farm mixed type facility if you both grow and harvest and process at your operation, just to be aware of that. So we talked about the produce being what is covered by produce safety rule and what exactly is produce, because some people say fruits and vegetables and forget about herbs. I forgot to say sprouts and microgreens. I should have put those in there. They're not written into the definition, so I didn't, but sprouts and microgreens are also considered produce. We talked about what is produce, what is not produce. Now, the activities that a farm does is growing, harvesting, packing, and holding. And just again, to increase the bounds of what you think of as growing, it can be in a field, but it can also be in a greenhouse or hydroponic. Harvesting can be either by hand or by machine, the two typical mechanisms. Packing can, the process of packing or the action of packing can include trimming and washing in addition to actually putting the produce into boxes or other containers. And then holding can include curing, like onions, or it can involve modified atmosphere or cooler storage or any other storage. Those are farm activities. And then just to reiterate, manufacturing processing is usually done at facilities. There are a few things that can be done at farms, like ripening and coloring, but in general, manufacturing processing is done at a facility covered by preventive controls rule. If this is important to you, I think I went far enough into the rabbit hole that you're probably satisfied by how much you learned or heard. But if you wanted to hear more, and if it's important to you to know the difference between a farm facility and a farm mixed type facility, and which things that are done at your operation and what category they put you in, this guidance is actually quite useful from FDA, and it's fairly easy to find, and it walks through scenario based to help you understand whether you're a farm or a facility and covered by the produce safety rule because of the activities that are done at your operation. The third element is the volume of produce sales. Low volume farms aren't covered by the produce safety rule, and that threshold for coverage is $25,000. Of course, it's not that simple because $25,000 when FSMA passed in 2011 is not the same as $25,000 in 2025. So the $25,000 threshold, they call it a cutoff, is adjusted for inflation to 2011. It's a 3-year rolling average, and a new value is published around April, sometimes March, sometimes April. Maybe it won't be published until May, but the FDA publishes a new value in the spring season of each year. It's called the FSMA inflation adjusted cutoffs. You can see the URL there. And if you scroll down to produce safety, you'll see that a farm or farm mix type facility with average annual monetary value of produce sold during 3 years average of less than 250,000 or $25,000, excuse me. That value is now for 2025, you would average the previous 3 years, 2022 to 2024, and that value is about $33,300. So here's a little bit of a conundrum in terms of coverage. If you sold less than $33,300 on average for the past 3 years, and you want to be able to say, I'm not covered by the produce safety rule, and someone calls you and say, I'm calling you to schedule a produce safety rule inspection. Although you're not required to have documentation to demonstrate your sales volume, it might be really helpful for you to have documentation to support your value, the value of your produce sold, in case you do get a phone call from our colleagues over at CDFA or the regulatory body in your state. This next one I always have to take a breath for because this is the one that gets a little bit complex. The fourth condition that can allow an entire farm to be exempt from most requirements of the produce safety rule is called the qualified exemption. And I said earlier that this deals with relatively small farms that are selling in a relatively local area. So When we say relatively small farm or relatively small business, in this case, we're talking about the food sales, not produce, but all the food sales. There's a cutoff of $500,000. Again, it's adjusted for inflation to 2011 dollars. Same as before, it's a 3-year rolling average, but instead of applying to just produce, it applies to non-produce foods like wheat and other grains. It also includes animal feed like alfalfa and hay. That value in 2025 would be the rolling average from 2022 to 2024. It's about $666,000 in today's dollar. If you back it for inflation to 2011, it would go to $500,000. So if your annual sales of total food is more than 666,000, you're not eligible for a qualified exemption. That's the first threshold. The second one is more than half of sales need to be to something called a qualified end user. A qualified end user can be the consumer, the person, the individual who actually ate the produce, or direct sales to a nearby retail food establishment or restaurant. So following the flow chart, if your annual sales of total food is more than 500,000, is less than $500,000, you can answer no. But then your next question is, are you selling more than half of your food to qualified end users? If the answer is no, you're not eligible. If the answer is yes, you are eligible for the qualified exemption. So let's talk about two things. One is retail food establishment, because you may not know exactly what that means. And the next one would be nearby. What exactly does nearby mean? A retail food establishment, and there is a formal definition in the Code of Federal Regulations. This is a summary of it. It's going to sell directly to consumers as its primary function. It sells food to the public, to those who are going to consume it. And some examples are grocery stores, convenience stores, vending machine locations like the ones at the airport, and then some, if not most, farm stands, farm markets, community-supported agriculture, and some mail order sales businesses that are marketing as their primary function direct to consumer food for consumption. So I think that should take care of what is a retail food establishment. Let's talk about nearby. Nearby means within 275 miles or the same state or the same Indian reservation. And those are FDA's words from the codified language. So let's talk about nearby in the context of a farm that's in San Luis Obispo, and 275 miles almost, but not quite, stretches to the border of Nevada, if I did my math right. But even if it did, that farm would be able to sell to retail food establishments or restaurants, and they would be qualified end users as long as they're within the state of California or possibly a little nubbin of Nevada that happens to be 275 miles away from the farm. So I think that covers many of you. Although if you are in the Central Valley or in the Sierra, then you're going to extend further into Nevada. That nearby definition can extend across a lot of borders in the US. So let's take Shiprock, New Mexico, which is within Navajo Nation up here in the northeast corner within the state of New Mexico. Because it's in the same state, it would be all of New Mexico, or the same Indian reservation, it would be all of Navajo Nation, including the part that's in Arizona outside the 275. But then also these parts of Arizona and Utah and Colorado that are within the 275-mile radius. So that's what nearby would mean to a farm that was growing produce in Shiprock, New Mexico. And then finally, let's go just south of the border from Yuma and Imperial Valley, and say you're growing some leafy greens down there. You could be all of Sonora State, as well as the 275-mile parts of California, Arizona, and Baja California. So that's a source of uncertainty a lot of times. What do we mean by a qualified end user? It has to be the consumer anywhere, or retail food establishment, which often means grocery store or CSA, or a restaurant within 275 miles, or it extends beyond that 275 miles into the same state or the same Indian reservation. So finally, if you are eligible for a qualified exemption, there are three things that you would need to continue to do under the produce safety rule. You would have labeling or a placard that includes the complete name and business address of the farm where the produce was grown, not the farm that's selling it, but the farm where it was growing. If it's a label, you may have other labeling requirements, such as what is in the package, as well as the weight of the package. If you're selling at a farm stand, if you're selling it from bulk bins, then you would put it on a placard. But this is the important thing, is having that name and business address. And Annalisa, my colleague from University of Minnesota, made this nice little graphic and fact sheet that shows just a placard that gives Sweet Acre Farms and the complete mailing address where the produce was grown at their farm stand where they're selling the produce. And if you wanted to see this fact sheet, there's a Google Doc that we can put into the follow up with you. The second thing you would need to do, in addition to this labeling and identifying where the produce was grown, is having your documentation of food sales, because in order to demonstrate that you're under that $666,000 cutoff limit, that's relevant in 2025. And also because, remember, you have to know that you're selling more than half to qualified end users annually. By calendar year, you're going to add up the sales in each category, qualified end users and other, and confirm that your qualified end user total is higher than your other market total. There are a large number of templates to help you do that calculation. Produce Safety Alliance has some. I believe the UC system has some, but I did not do my homework to know. I expect they do. Many states have put forward templates to help you do the calculation, because so many farms are eligible for qualified exemptions, or at least they are potentially eligible for qualified exemptions. Some other things to consider when you're talking about eligibility for a qualified exemption is who you sell to may affect your eligibility status. So being one step away from the consumer is the situation a lot of farms are in. You grow the food, you sell it direct to consumer through your CSA, through your farm stand, or at the farm market. There's one receipt, it's direct to consumer. That is always going to be a qualified end user. But sometimes you're selling things to a buddy, like a neighbor with a market booth, and you're saying, I don't want to go to market, but I've got these 5 bushels of whatever that I want to sell. Would you mind? Can I sell it to you and you'll sell it at my stand? As long as that neighbor with the market booth is a qualified end user, this is a two receipt situation and can be eligible for as a qualified end user. Local restaurants would be, a neighbor with a market booth would be, as long as they are a qualified end user, meaning they would need to meet the criteria for a retail food establishment. So in this two receipts scenario, the middle buyer has to be a qualified end user, meaning it's either restaurant or retail food establishment within those location restrictions. There's a third scenario where it's not going to be a qualified end user, and that's if you're selling to a distribution center, which is not a qualified end user. It doesn't matter who the distribution center sells to eventually, because they're not a qualified end user. It doesn't count as a sale to a qualified end user. So it may go through a restaurant, it may go through a grocery, or it may go through a repacker to the consumer. But we have not found a situation where there's more than 2 receipts that's eligible for use as a qualified end user. So sometimes knowing the definition of qualified end user is useful. Sometimes just thinking about it as 1 receipt, 2 receipt, 3 receipts situations, where 1 receipt is between you and the consumer is always eligible. More than 2 receipts is not going to be eligible as qualified end user. And if there are 2 receipts, as long as that middle buyer is a qualified end user, should be eligible should meet your eligibility requirements for qualified end user and the qualified exemption. This is actually the first time I presented it that way. I'm not sure if it's simpler or harder, but we've gone through it, and I welcome feedback on it as to whether that is an effective way to understand that particular aspect of qualified exemption. We always learn. A second part of this is it can sometimes it's not the farm that's exempt or not covered, it's the crop that's exempt or not covered. So if your farm is covered, not eligible for the exemption, there are a few other things to consider, such as where's the produce eaten? There's an exemption for on-farm consumption. I'm sorry, an exclusion for on-farm consumption. How is the produce eaten? There's an exclusion for rarely consumed raw produce. And then is the produce processed by a buyer? There's another exemption for commercial processing with the kill step. Where the produce is eaten, let's say these volunteers at the UC Davis farm were actually the consumers and that was their lunch and they're going to eat it on the farm. The produce safety rule does not cover farmer food, kitchen gardens, other food that you grow for yourself or for on-farm consumption. A little bit more complex is how's the produce normally eaten? There's a list of 34 things, and there's a diagram to the right here that shows those 34 things. Those are the only things that are excluded from the produce safety rule because they're considered rarely consumed raw. Some people, I'm in Minnesota, and a lot of people in Wisconsin culturally make the choice to eat potatoes raw. They just like raw potatoes. For them, potatoes may not be rarely consumed raw, but statistically, the process that FDA went through to comprise the list of 34 items, statistically, potatoes are rarely consumed raw. If you go to Hawaii, you'll see taro. Taro is never consumed raw because it gives you a terrible stomach ache. But taro is not on the list of rarely consumed raw because it didn't meet the statistical criteria. You can think of a lot of things that are or are not in reality rarely consumed raw. That's why I always put the quotes around the rarely consumed raw list because these are the only 34 things that are excluded because they're rarely consumed raw. If you're growing ginger, asparagus, dates. One that kills me is figs because in California we like to eat our figs fresh, but they are on the rarely consumed raw list, and so they are excluded from produce safety rule. In addition to that, I'll just say that maybe FDA heard that they made a poor choice about not including a few other crop types in an exclusion status. Almonds, wine grape varieties, hops, and pulse crops like lentils. Those four categories, this is not in the codified rule, but FDA put out a policy memo that says we are not going to enforce the produce safety rule against almonds, wine grape varieties, hops, and pulse crops like lentils. Almonds are under a marketing order that when they're sold to consumer, they're always pasteurized. And correct me if I'm wrong, there are people online who know better than I, but my understanding is that's the reason for almonds is because of the marketing order, where the vast majority are going to be treated before they're sold in a way pasteurized that's going to control pathogens. Wine grapes typically almost entirely are going into a fermentation process, as are hops that should control the pathogens. And pulse crops like lentils are almost always going to be cooked in a way that'll control the pathogens. So that's the rationale behind the enforcement discretion for just those four. Unlike the codified requirements like the rarely consumed raw list, enforcement discretion can go away at any time, and other enforcement discretion policies can be added at any time. So it's a much more flexible option, but we have to keep an eye on it to ensure that it's still in effect as we make decisions based on a policy like that from FDA. Finally, there's if the produce will be processed with a kill step. So it's not just any commercial processing, it's processing with a kill step. An example of something that is processing that's not a kill step is freezing. Another one is washing. Those are not kill steps. But if it's sold into processing that will kill pathogens, it's exempt from produce safety rule. There's a requirement that the farm must say a very specific thing in documentation to the buyer. A lot of times this is on the bill of sale. Not processed to adequately reduce the presence of microorganisms of public health significance, which just means that it may or may not have pathogens on it. Be sure to process it to remove the risk of pathogens. In the regulatory requirements, the buyer must provide written assurance to the grower or the seller that the produce will actually be processed. This is another example of that policy where FDA has put out a policy memo that they're not enforcing the buyer documentation, but the grower still has, for instance, if you're selling paste tomatoes that are going into a paste canning process, the grower or the processor slash seller of those tomatoes would need to put this document on its documentation to the buyer. Some examples of those kill steps include processes that are under some existing laws that are called juice HACCP, low acid canning rule, and acidified foods rule. And then there are other validated processes like refining, distilling, or processing of product into sugar, oil, spirits, wine, beer, or other similar products. So that comes out of the codified regulation to give you an idea of what does a kill step entail. Those are the exemptions and exclusions, but I'm not quite done with you because I really want to go through the flow chart. The logic of the flow chart has its merits, but what's important is that if you are inspected, it's going to be important to be able to go through that flow chart and follow the flow chart so you can describe to the person who's asking you, are you exempt or not exempt and why? We don't have to go through them in detail, but I want to hang those concepts. I like the order that they were presented in. To me, it's logical and makes sense doing it by farm, then by product. But let's run through it just briefly on the flow chart itself so that you can hang it on the flow chart and just remember what those ideas were. The first line, the yellow line, is do you grow, harvest, pack, or hold produce? If you grow, harvest, pack, or hold produce and it's a raw agricultural commodity, the farm, if you do not do that, then your farm is not covered by the rule. So, produce safety rule, if you don't grow, pack, or hold grow, harvest, pack, or hold produce, you're not covered by the produce safety rule. This makes sense. The minimum sales cutoff, the red one. This is the $25,000 line, which is actually $33,300 inflated for when adjusted for inflation. So if your farm is selling less than that 33.3, then your farm is not covered by the rule at all. So helpful to have the documentation, not required because there's nothing to require you. You're not covered by the rule. But if you needed to demonstrate to someone or convince them that you're not covered because of sales volume, it would be helpful to have the documentation. Remember, that's a 3-year rolling average. Then we switch gears and we talked about a product. So the rarely consumed raw list, these are those same 33 products on the rarely consumed raw list. Product by product, they may or may not be covered by the produce safety rule. So the product is not covered. And in the FDA flowchart, it says go through one by one and evaluate whether that particular commodity is covered by the rule. If all you grow is figs, you may be a covered farm, but there's nothing for you to, well, actually, you're not growing any covered produce, so you're not covered by the produce safety rule. But if you're growing figs plus something like, well, slicing tomatoes. Not that it, well, if you're growing figs plus slicing tomatoes, you would still need to follow produce safety rule for your slicing tomatoes. Then we go to on-farm consumption. Again, this is for a particular product. If it's for personal or on-farm consumption, it is not covered by the rule. Then we go to the commercial kill step. Again, this is the product is eligible for exemption. This is the first time we're talking about exemption, but the exemptions always come with strings attached. The processing must include a kill step and the documentation requirements for eligibility. That line from the farm to the buyer is required. The assurances from the buyer to the farm is not currently being enforced. Then you get into the big one, the qualified exemption, which is the $500,000 cutoff, which is currently $666,000, and the majority of food sold directly to qualified end users is more than other sales. And again, the definition of qualified end user is the consumer or restaurant or retail food establishment within 275 miles or the same state or the same Indian reservation as the farm that produced the food. When you get through all that, and then there are also, so when you get through all that, if the conditions do not apply, the farm is covered by the rule for those products that are not exempt or excluded from the rule. That's the overall FSMA produce safety rule, exemptions and exclusions. Within the rule, there are a couple of spots where there are line by line exemptions, and those you'll learn in the If you take the PSA grower training course, those are discussed in each module of the course, the exemptions that apply within that module. Or you can talk to your local educator, whether that educator is from industry, from extension, from the State Department of Ag, or FDA, or other organizations. Many consultants in California have an excellent background and are able to do a lot of outreach and help understanding these regulatory requirements. So in summary, managing produce safety is going to affect everyone because of consumer health outcomes, because your market access, either through buyer requirements or market agreement requirements, and then there are also regulatory requirements that keep your farm in that keep it that make it possible for your farm to access the market and sell the good, again, the nutritious, healthy food that we really try to provide to our consumers. Those regulatory requirements in the FSMA produce safety rule have some boundaries. They're called exclusions, they're called exemptions, and then those policies, those one-offs that are temporary, that pop up and go away sometimes, are called enforcement discretion. You can be excluded from the whole regulation. You can be exempt from most of the regulation or just one regulatory requirement. And let me just put out the pitch, whether or not you're covered. The regulatory requirements didn't come from nowhere. They came from the science and the risk-based management practices that help keep produce safe, that help keep farms viable, that help keep our system secure. So whether or not you're covered, please do tune in for the rest of the webinars for your awareness of industry accepted practices and the ability to make good line-by-line decisions. I threw in a quiz, and then I realized that nobody can actually answer these questions because you don't have the ability to unmute, and I don't think you have the ability to chat. So I suppose what I'll do is just ask the questions and then answer the questions. I'll give you a second to think through it yourself, but we've just got 4 questions to drive home. The first quiz question is, a farm that sells an average of $19,000 in produce, let's say this farm is 2025, $19,000 in produce over a 3-year period. So every year it's $19,000 at a local farmer's market and through a CSA. Are they covered by the FSMA produce safety rule? Think about your answer. Send it across the airwaves. I'll be very receptive to your psychic signals. And it seems to me that almost everybody answered correctly that no, they don't sell enough produce because they didn't hit that $33,300 cutoff to be covered. So let's switch gears and talk about a diversified farm that's they sell $50,000 in regular produce, in fresh produce, raw agricultural commodities, but then they also process and they sell $750,000 in value-added products, including sauerkraut and jam. Again, this is 3-year rolling average. So are they eligible for a qualified exemption? Remember, there are 2 criteria, the $500,000 cutoff and then the proportion of sales. So again, I think we have an audience of very receptive people who heard and remembered all the things that were said. And you know that even though they sell enough produce, the $50,000 is more than the 33.3. They sell too much total food, more than $666,000 to be eligible for that exemption because their total food sales is $800,000, even though most of it is not produce. The third question, we get into our math. So get out your pen and paper, get ready to do some math. A farm sells $475,000 in produce, 3-year rolling average. They don't sell any other food. 200K goes to a wholesaler out of state. 200K goes to a local restaurant, and 75K is direct to consumer. Are they eligible for a qualified exemption? So think about that for a second because you have to do 2 pieces of math. It's not very hard math, but it still takes a minute to do those math. And so, yes, the total food the first cutoff is $666,000. Their total is 475. It's less than 666, so they meet that cutoff. And The sales to qualified end users, which includes the local restaurant and the direct-to-consumer farmers market, those add up to 275. Since 275 is more than the 200, they sell more than half to qualified end users, so they meet both of the eligibility requirements for a qualified exemption. And then finally, the last question is a farm that sells $67,000 in produce annually to a distributor that's more than 275 miles away. So they're not eligible for a qualified exemption because the distributor is more than 275 miles away in a different state. But here's the thing. They grow these four things that are on the rarely consumed raw list. And these two things, they only sell $20,000 in these two things that are actually covered produce. Are they covered by the produce safety rule? So think about the $25,000 cutoff. And to give away the answer, they are covered because it's their total produce sales. It's not their covered produce sales. It's the total produce sales. And even though potatoes, pumpkins, sweet corn, and winter squash are on the rarely consumed raw list, they're still produce, and those sales still count to the total. So you're comparing the 33.3 against this value, not against the $20,000. So that is quite enough talking from me. Thank you for your patience and your attention to this to this depiction of exemptions, exclusions, qualified, I'm sorry, yeah, the qualified exemption, enforcement discretion, all the things that you might need to know about coverage status under produce safety rule. And I'm going to stop sharing screen so that we can get into any questions that might be there.
There's a question, Don, in the
Yeah.
Q&A. I think Ahmed already answered, but
I
Joyce
think so.
asked if you could clarify the